Chapter 55 on the monstrous pictures of whales. I shall ere long paint to you, as well as one can without canvas, something like the true form of the whale as he actually appears to the eye of the whaleman, when in his own absolute body the whale is moored alongside the whale ship, so that he can be fairly stepped up upon there. It may be worthwhile, therefore, previously to advert to those curious imaginary portraits of him which even down to the present day confidently challenge the faith of the landsman. It is time to set the world right in this matter, by proving such pictures of the whale all wrong. It may be that the primal source of all of these pictorial delusions will be found among the oldest Hindu, Egyptian, and Grecian sculptures. For ever since those inventive but unscrupulous times when, on the marble panellings of temples, the pedestals of statues, and on shields, medallions, cups, and coins, the dolphin was drawn in scales of chain armor like Saladin's, and helmeted head like St. George's, ever since then has something of the same sort of license prevailed, not only in the most popular pictures of the whale, but in many scientific presentations of him. Now, by all odds, the most ancient and extant portrait, anyways purported to be the whale's, is to be found in the famous cavern pagoda of Elephanta in India. The Brahmins maintain that in the almost endless sculptures of that immemorial pagoda, all the trades and pursuits, every conceivable avocation of man, were prefigured ages before any of them actually came into being. No wonder, then, that in some sort our noble profession of whaling should have been there shadowed forth. The Hindu whale referred to occurs in a separate departure of the wall, depicting the incarnation of Vishnu in the form of Leviathan, learnedly known as the Matsya Avatar. But though this sculpture is half man and half whale, so as only to give the tail of the latter, yet that small section of him is all wrong. It looks more like the tapering tail of an anaconda than the broad palms of a true whale's majestic flukes. But to go on to the old galleries and look now at a great Christian painter's portrait of this fish, for he succeeds no better than the antediluvian Hindu. It is Guido's picture of Perseus rescuing Andromeda from the sea monster or whale. Where did Guido get the model of such a strange creature as that? Nor does Hogarth, in painting the same scene in his own Perseus Descending, make out one whit better. The huge corpulence of that Hogarthian monster undulates on the surface, scarcely drawing 1 inch of water. It is a sort of howdah on its back, and its distended tusked mouth, into which the billows are rolling, might be taken for the Trader's Gate leading from the Thames by water into the Tower. Then there are the Podromus whales of old Scotch Sibbald, and Jonah's whale as depicted in the prints of old Bibles and cuts of old primers. What shall be said of these? As for the bookbinder's whale winding like a vine stalk round the stock of a distending anchor, as stamped and gilded on the backs and title pages of many books, both new and old. That is very picturesque but purely fabulous creature, imitated, I take it, from the like figures of antique vases. Though universally denominated a dolphin, I nevertheless call this bookbinder's fish an attempt at a whale, because it is so intended with the device when the device was first introduced. It was introduced by an old Italian publisher somewhere about the 15th century, during the revival of learning, and in those days, even down to a comparatively late period, dolphins were popularly supposed to be a species of the Leviathan. In the vignettes and other embellishments of some ancient books you will find at times meet with very curious touches at the whale, where all manner of spouts, jets d'eau, hot springs and cold, Saratoga and Baden-Baden come bubbling up from the unexhausted brain. In the title page of the original edition of The Advancement of Learning, you will find some curious whales. But quitting all these unprofessional attempts, let us glance at those pictures of Leviathan purporting to be sober scientific delineations by those who know. In old Harris's collection of voyages, there are some plates of whales extracted from a Dutch book of voyages, A.D. 1671, entitled A Whaling Voyage to Spitzenberg on the Ship Jonas and the Whale, Peter Peterson of Friesland, master. In one of those plates, the whales, like great rafts of log, are represented lying among ice isles of white bears running over their living backs. In another plate, the prodigious blunder is made of representing the whale with perpendicular flukes. Then again, there is an imposing quarto written by one Captain Colnett, a post captain in the English Navy, entitled "A Voyage Round Cape Horn into the South Seas for the Purpose of Extending the Spermaceti Whale Fisheries." In this book is an outline purporting to be a picture of a visitor or spermaceti whale drawn by scale from one killed on the coast of Mexico, August 1793, and hoisted on deck. I doubt not that the captain had this veracious picture taken for the benefit of his marines. To mention but one thing about it, let me say that it has an eye which applied, according to the accompanying scale, to a full-grown sperm whale, would make the eye of that whale bow window some 5 feet long. Ah, my gallant captain, why did ye not give us Jonah looking out of that eye? Nor are the most conscientious compilations of natural history for the benefit of the young and tender, free from the same heinousness of mistake. Look at that popular work, Goldsmith's Animated Nature, in the abridged London edition of 1807. There are not plates of an alleged whale and narwhal. I do not think to seem elegant, but this unsightly whale looks much like an amputated sow. As for the narwhal, one glance at it is enough to amaze one in this 19th century such a hippogriff could be palmed for genuine upon any intelligent public of schoolboys. Then again, in 1825, Bernard Germain, Count de la Sapede, a great naturalist, published a scientific systemized whale book, wherein are several pictures of different species of the Leviathan. All of these are not only incorrect, but the picture of the mystistius or Greenland whale, that is to say, the right whale. Even Scoresby, a long experienced man as touching that species, declares not to have its counterpart in nature. But the placing of the cap sheaf in all of this blundering business was reserved for the scientific Frederick Cuvier, brother of the famous Baron. In 1836 he published a natural history of whales, in which he gives what he calls a picture of the sperm whale. Before showing that picture to any Nantucketer, you'd best provide for your summary retreat from Nantucket. In a word, Frederick Cuvier's sperm whale is not a sperm whale, but a squash. Of course, he never had the benefit of a whaling voyage, such men seldom have, but once he derived that picture, who can tell? Perhaps he got it in his scientific predecessor in the same field, Desmarest, got of his authentic abortions, that is, from a Chinese drawing. And what sort of lively lads with the pencil those Chinese are. Many queer cups and saucers inform us. As for the sign painter's whales seen in the streets hanging over the shops of oil dealers, what shall be said of them? They are generally Richard III whales, with dromedary humps and very savage, breakfasting on 3 or 4 sailor tarts that is, whale boats full of mariners, their deformities floundering in seas of blood and blue paint. But these manifold mistakes in depicting the whale are not very, very surprising after all. Consider, most of the scientific drawings have been taken from stranded fish, and these are about as correct as the drawing of a wrecked ship with a broken back would correctly represent the noble animal itself in all its undashed pride of hull and spars. Though elephants have stood for their full lengths, the living Leviathan has never fairly floated himself for his portrait. The living whale, in his full majesty and significance, is only to be seen at sea in unfathomable waters, and afloat the vast bulk of him is out of sight, like a launched line of a battleship, and out of its element. It's the thing eternally impossible for mortal men to hoist him bodily into the air, so as to preserve all his mighty swells and undulations. And not to speak of the highly presumable difference of contour between a young suckling whale and a full-grown Platonian leviathan. Yet even in the case of one of these young suckling whales hoisted to a ship's deck, such is the outlandish, eel-like, limbered, varying shape of him, that his precise expression of the devil himself could not catch. But it may be fancied that from the naked skeleton of the stranded whale, accurate hints may be derived touching its true form. Not at all, for it is one of the more curious things about this Leviathan that his skeleton gives you very little idea of his general shape. Though Jeremy Bentham's skeleton, which hangs for a candelabra in the library of one of his executors, correctly conveys the idea of the burly bowed utilitarian old gentleman, with Jeremy's other leading personal characteristics. Yet nothing of this kind could be inferred from any Leviathan articulated bones. In fact, as the great hunter says, the mere skeleton of the whale bears the same relation to the fully invested and padded animal as the insect does to the chrysalis that so resoundingly envelops it. This peculiarity is strikingly evinced in the head, as in some part of this book will be incidentally shown. It is also very curiously displayed in the side fin, the bones in which are almost exactly answer to the bones of the human hand, minus only the thumb. The fin has 4 regular bone fingers, the index, middle, ring, and little finger, but all of these are permanently lodged in their fleshy covering, as the human fingers in an artificial covering. However recklessly the whale may sometimes serve us, said humorous Stubb one day, he can never truly be said to handle us without mittens. For all of these reasons, then, any way you may look at it, you must needs conclude that the great Leviathan is one creature in the world which must remain unpainted to the last. True, one portrait may hit the mark and be nearer than another, but none can hit it with any considerable degree of exactness. So there is no earthly way of finding out precisely what the whale really looks like, and the only mode in which you can derive even a tolerable idea of his living contour is by going a whaling yourself, but so doing you run no small risk of being eternally stove and sunk by him. Wherefore it seems to me that you'd best not be too fastidious with your curiosity touching this Leviathan. This is the end of chapter 55. Now, the author touches on some interesting things here about how difficult it is to properly portray the way a whale looks, because people only typically see beached whales. So once the whale is up on land, it kind of flattens out because all of its bulk is supported by the water. So a whale is right around neutrally buoyant, which means that its flesh has about the same weight as water, which means that it just sort of floats there. So if you're floating in water, various parts of the body that on land would sag, droop, just kind of float there. And with a whale, you only need a little bit of structure. So if you're to think about a water balloon, and if you're to take a balloon full of water, put it in a bucket of water, it's a different shape than when it's lying flat on the concrete. So if you take a water balloon, you put it in a bucket of water, you can look and you can see the shape, and it takes on a different shape than it does when it's resting on the ground. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is that he talks about seeing the bones of the whale. And when you see the bones of the whale, you can kind of imagine the shape of the body that goes on it. But the problem is that there's a whole bunch of fleshy stuff that exists that you may not know about. So for the longest time, people reconstructed pictures of dinosaurs by just sort of stretching the skin tightly over the bones. And that leads to these fearsome looking monsters. But the thing is that some dinosaurs had feathers, and you never really knew how much flesh there was that went over things. So, I mean, if you're to take a look at a hippo has bones, and but there's also this large amount of flesh that circles the face. So you wouldn't know that it has these huge flappy lips. And I mean, a hippo defleshed looks like it has these massive fangs and it's like reaching out to bite you. Not this round, puffy, jovial, hello, I'm a hippo face. Now, a couple years ago, I went down to Assateague. And I was told by the ranger, hey, if you go out a good distance, and good distance in this case was like 10 or 15, it was like 5 miles. So if you go down 5 miles to the south tip of the island, there's a whale skeleton there. So this was from a humpback whale that got sick and beached itself, because whales, dolphins, etc. sometimes beach themselves when they're sick, because there's the idea that maybe they can get better on land, and if they're out at sea when they're sick, they risk just drowning. So because they can only go down, if they go down they can't get back up, or they're just floating on the surface and they don't feel well and they fall asleep. And so there's a theory that some whales, when they're sick, beach themselves. Anyway, this whale was beached, ended up dying on the beach. And as I said, it's a 5-mile walk. There are no roads to this part of the beach. There are no roads even close to this part of the beach. But so I walked 5 miles down and I saw pictures of the whale bones. And the skull was a good 5 or 6 feet long. Now, this was as I said, this was a humpback whale. And humpback whales don't have much flesh over the top, so the shape of the skull is kind of the shape of the head. Sperm whales, on the other hand, have this thing called a melon, and then they have the spermaceti organ on top of that. And they have this kind of low, flat skull, but there's this massive bulge of fat on top. So, I mean, imagine, you see the shape of my head here. Imagine if it was up to here of just this flesh. So if I had like this puffy, fleshy head thing sticking up out of my head, and you would never know that from the shape of my skull, because my skull goes like this. But if I had this fleshy, bubbly whatever up above my head like this, you would never know by just looking at me. And sperm whales actually have this. Beluga whales have the same sort of thing. Beluga whale is closely related to the dolphin, and the skull looks very much like a dolphin's. But instead of having the long beak, it's puffy out in front. So you really can't necessarily tell what something looks like by its bones. And if something lives in the water, you can't really tell what it exactly is shaped like once it's up on land. Now, perhaps Ishmael doesn't give some of the painters and such enough credit, and obviously some of the things are modified to be artistic, stylized, so that it's not like a true depiction of the whale. It's sort of an impression of the whale, because he talked about it being wrapped around letters. So often when you have letters in books, they have something called a drop cap, where you have a large stylized letter of the first letter of a book. So a sentence begins with the, you would have this capital T that's like 3 or 4 lines tall, that's all embellished and whatever. And if you were talking about a whale, then you could have a whale kind of wrapped around it, and it wouldn't really look like a whale, but it gives more the impression of T. Or actually, if you're to do Call Me Ishmael from the first beginning of the book, you could have a C with a whale head or a whale mouth, and it doesn't necessarily match it. And yeah, a lot of these things are people don't actually see the thing. So an artist being told, oh yeah, there's a whale. The whale is this giant thing in the water. And so thinks, oh, it's in the water, it must be a fish. And fish have the vertical fin, and fish have scales. Well, whales are big things in the water, but they have the horizontal fin, or the horizontal tail, and they don't have scales. They have little hair, some of them. Anyway, that is chapter 55.